America has a habit of bombing civilians. Now it's yet another civilian hospital. According to an Associated Press report, on October the 3rd, 2015, the American Army Green Berets deliberately requested a deadly airstrike on a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders in the northern Afghan city of Kunduz. Two witnesses claim to have seen documents indicating, before the American AC-130 gunship attack, that a senior officer in the Green Beret unit had discussed the hospital with the country director of the medical charity, presumably in Kabul. It is claimed the Americans thought it was being operated by the Taliban. Tim Shenk, as spokesman for the humanitarian group Doctors Without Borders, says that shortly before the attack, an official in Washington asked them whether our hospital had a large group of Taliban militants in it, and we replied that this was not the case. We also stated that we were very clear with both sides to the conflict about the need to respect medical structures. One day after US military commander General John Campbell in Afghanistan acknowledged the bombing, US President Barack Obama apologized for the deadly attack which killed 30 people. The merciless strike, which lasted for more than an hour, led to the closure of the MSF-run trauma clinic, depriving tens of thousands of Afghans of vital health care. Within 4 weeks of this hospital bombing by the US, her ally, Saudi Arabia, also bombed a functioning hospital, this time in Yemen, drawing global condemnation. Why has the US bombed a hospital run by a charity? Has the US set a new precedent for others, including Saudi Arabia, to bomb hospitals as well? And what sentiments will these attacks provoke towards America? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. Let's start with a basic question. The US bombed an Afghan hospital in October. A report reveals they were fully aware that it was a functioning hospital. What does this say about the US's approach to the sanctity of life? We put that question to the public.
I think that it says that the Americas wasn't thinking the big picture. They probably had their intentions but wasn't thinking about the life of the people that were in the hospital.
We take lives and it's kind of like, that's the big issue right now. Are we protecting lives? Are we sending our troops into, like, for example, Obama just sent his troops into Syria now. And it's like, what is our goal, you know?
I know that Obama issued an apology for it. What I didn't know is that they knew beforehand that it was a hospital.
Well, as I've thought about it, I don't know what it means, because I don't know why the U.S. went ahead and bombed that hospital post knowing that the Doctors Without Borders said there were no Taliban hiding in there.
Well, it doesn't have much approach to it, as it allows abortion. It bombed Iraq to begin with, and shock and awe they boasted about, so it says about the same thing it's always been saying.
Generally, it says that obviously life is expendable. Who actually gave the permission is the important factor here, and the truth is always the hardest thing to find at the very last, at the very end. So who knows how it happened, but yes, by bombing a hospital is very sad.
In the light of the report confirming that the US knew it was bombing a working hospital, what do our experts conclude about the US's perspective on the sanctity of life?
Well, in essence, the United States as a superpower, which apparently creates this aura of humanitarianism around itself, such atrocities and activities, including the bombing of schools, which was in October, is essentially a reprehensible act which reflects very negatively and poorly on the United States' image on a global level. These are countries which have such sophisticated weapons, laser-guided missiles, that it would be inconceivable to suspect that they could attack such kind of defenseless areas and such areas of civilian infrastructure. And in essence, this is ultimately a weapon of war, attacking civilian areas and civilian locations with the most extremely sophisticated weapons. And this has been a recurring feature in all of the United States interventions within the Middle East and the wider Arab and Muslim world.
Well, if this is true, that the relevant commanders knew that this was a hospital, then this really does create a new picture of what the ground rules are for the war on terror for the Western countries, because this means that they are openly prepared to attack targets which are not just civilian targets, but are targets with a concentration of humanitarian workers, a concentration of ill, wounded people, and that really there's no holes barred at all. They're prepared to do anything and to attack any target. So, I mean, you know, this is in a certain sense a revelation. We knew there was large numbers of civilian casualties. We knew there was what the US like to call collateral damage, but this is the deliberate targeting of a civilian establishment, which does kind of shed really a new light on what the US are doing in the war on terror. Added to that is the fact that, you know, it's only now that the truth is coming out, weeks and weeks after the atrocity. It's only now that we're learning the real truth here. So this is a war crime, and it's also a war crime that the US have done their best to cover up. And indeed, it appears as if the whole terms of engagement that the US armed forces are bound by has also been completely covered up right throughout the war on terror. So, I mean, you know, this is a very sinister and worrying revelation.
Days before the attack, the humanitarian group Doctors Without Borders made it clear to Washington there were no Taliban militants and called on the US to respect medical structures. Why did the US bomb it anyway? Here's what the public said.
Someone who had the authority to make the bombing decision must have felt that there was, regardless of what the Doctors Without Borders said, felt there was enough people that posed greater risk to the world or the American people than they valued as a few individuals in that hospital at the time.
Obviously, extremists are a few. That's the minority, you know, and then everywhere there are extremist groups, and we're attacking like this entire group based on very little information.
I don't know why the U.S. would bomb it, but we need to really use our intelligence more wisely and focus on places that we can be more useful, especially considering the fact that we don't have as much military and don't have as much manpower as we need.
Did the U.S. believe that the doctors were giving the correct information, or did the U.S. have information that said that information is not credible? And I don't know the answer to that. If it was credible, then it ought to be completely wrong that they did it. If it was not credible, then I don't know how you would call the U.S.'s action improper.
Maybe somewhere in the chain of command there was a disagreement with the Doctors Without Borders, which is sad to say the least because they are more of a peaceful group.
Wow, that's a hard question to answer. Who knows? Who made that decision? That's the big question, isn't it? And why it happened. It shouldn't have happened, and a serious mistake was made.
On the face of it, America's decision to attack, despite clarification that this was a working hospital free of Taliban, seems hard to understand. Can our experts shed light on the reasons behind this action?
When the United States is in a state of war, it does not adhere to the common principles of human rights and humanitarianism, and it would see any medical facility or civilian infrastructure as a legitimate target if they suspect enemy fighters to be within the vicinity of the area. This is something which other countries such as Israel have done very recently as well. But considering the fact that there was no legitimate evidence of Taliban fighters within the vicinity, then this is essentially a war crime. The targeting of innocent civilians in a medical facility where people are under treatment, people are injured, people are ill, and the United States has shown a very distinct disregard for human life, and this has been very evident throughout the duration of its presence in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and this is something which is unlikely to change within the foreseeable future.
Well, I mean, I've got absolutely no idea. There really seems to be no justification for this whatsoever. If that information did indeed come through to the people in charge of this mission, it is quite extraordinary that the US went ahead with the attack anyway. Maybe they believed there was Taliban there, but I mean, it's quite clear that there wasn't, and it seems anyway very, very unlikely that the Taliban would be able to mount any kind of operation from a hospital. So it just passes all understanding. And you know, one interpretation is that they are simply making these attacks in order to cause the maximum terror and the maximum level of intimidation in areas where the Taliban are, they assume, are active by their own assumptions. But I mean, it's quite clear that this is a catastrophic act, and this is an act that will only increase the amount of bitterness and anger that people in Afghanistan feel about the Western interventions and about what the West has been doing. And so it is likely to actually strengthen the ability of the Taliban to recruit, to organise, and to increase their resistance. So, I mean, completely counterproductive, and at the same time, what appears to be a criminal act.
President Obama has apologised for the attack. If your loved ones were amongst the 30 killed, would an apology be enough, or would you want something more? Here are the public's responses.
What more would I want? I would want my loved ones back, which will never happen no matter what is done. If they were American citizens, I would like to see them treated with the respect that American citizens should do, and words is not sufficient.
I would definitely want some sort of like letter or something like that, him saying that in person to me instead of saying like that from a long distance.
Honestly, I want an explanation. I want to explain. Why would you do that? Why would you do that?
That's a good question. I'm sure I would definitely want more.
That's hard to say. I don't know what I'd say if I had a loved one. That's a totally different story. I don't have a loved one that was hurt.
Now, I'm not sure what more you could ask for. I mean, it's typical of what he would do, but his apology is basically meaningless.
Do our experts feel an apology from the American president makes up for this catastrophic decision to attack the hospital, killing so many people?
If you were among the actual families of the people who died in this particular atrocity, the words of President Obama would be meaningless. They would not actually console you, or even any sympathy which you gain from the United States on an official level would actually be rejected, because the loss of life is among the worst things to happen to any particular individual. And for Obama to say sorry in this manner is clearly for the purpose of media image. It's ultimately to show the world that he's a very sympathetic person and he understands that the crime has been committed. But if you were one of the people who had suffered directly from this particular atrocity, these words would be really falling on deaf ears, because the problem is much deeper and much more defined than a particular apology here and there. And the United States often apologises for its crimes and atrocities, but at the same time, the invasion of a foreign country and to actually bomb its people in this particular manner, especially a medical facility, actually shows that the United States values interests and foreign policy objectives over human life, and that's something which is very saddening.
Well, I mean, you know, it's hard to imagine what it must be like to be anywhere near this kind of attack or these kind of operations, and certainly to have people, family or friends being killed in them. I mean, an apology clearly isn't enough. What I think lots of people probably feel in Afghanistan is more than anything that the Western intervention needs to end. That, I mean, this isn't the first incident of its kind during the, what is it now, 14 years of occupation. There's been huge numbers of similar incidents. Attacks on weddings, attacks on funerals, other attacks on hospitals and other civilian institutions. And I think, you know, it's no surprise that actually the Taliban is now stronger than it was certainly in the period immediately after the invasion back in 2001. So, you know, I think this will increase the bitterness and the anger that people feel about Western intervention. I guess people feel what they need more than bombs is reparations, is a huge investment program that can begin to undo some of the infrastructural damage that has been created by the occupation.
Saudi Arabia also bombed a Yemeni hospital supported by the UN Children's Fund. Has the US set a new precedent for Saudi Arabia to bomb hospitals? The public shared their opinions.
Not sure I can answer that question at the moment.
I do not know that answer.
I think Saudi Arabia, I don't think was bombing hospitals before, but it was definitely gassing and using chemical weapons on its own people. This is not a regime that would change its direction of attack because America did something. It would use awful attacks against any humanity if it was a threat to its own society or self.
If the U.S. is setting a precedence for Middle Eastern countries, I would like the Middle Eastern countries to be following us in more pro-life and pro-Christian actions, not hurtful ones.
I think that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. is a very balanced relationship, and that we neither influence them positively or negatively, and that they are making decisions based on their own foreign policy kind of regulations I don't know, that's difficult as well.
I do not know, but I sure hope not.
That I don't know, but I certainly know the United States and Saudi are good friends, and I don't understand that because there's a lot of things that the Saudis do which should be questioned.
Is Saudi Arabia following a precedent set by America in the bombing of a Yemeni hospital, again run by a charity? Our experts were quite clear about this.
Well, ultimately, the precedent for such countries as Saudi Arabia, which are being used in the Middle East, is the greater American intervention within the Middle East, which has happened over the last 20 years. And Saudi Arabia is following the lead of the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan by bombing Yemen in a very systematic and very destructive way. And the fact that Saudi would use its own very sophisticated weapons, which come from the United States, to bomb civilian infrastructures, medical facilities, is ultimately symptomatic of the way that both of these allies view the Middle East. But what is more shocking is that whilst the United States is bombing a foreign country, Saudi Arabia is bombing a fellow Muslim and a fellow Arab country. Now this is very unprecedented, and the level of destruction being caused by Saudi Arabian bombing of Yemen has actually ripped the country into pieces and torn huge shreds out of Yemeni infrastructure. Now this is something which the Saudi Arabians are doing on a deliberate basis to destroy Yemen from the inside. And they have ultimately taken the lead of what the United States did in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, I don't know if these two incidents are directly linked, they may be, but certainly what is true is that the pretense of the US and its Western allies to be fighting these wars in the name of the values of civilization, of democracy, of liberty and so forth, is now thoroughly exposed, not just by this incident, but by the whole experience of the war on terror over the last 14 years. The fact of the matter is that the West's actions have led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, and now in Iraq again. And the idea that, these wars have been essentially mounted for humanitarian, peace or democratic reasons is now unfortunately regarded as ludicrous, I think, by many people in the world. These wars are really being fought for geopolitical advantage, and in those circumstances, the Western powers are prepared to accept that they're going to kill large numbers of innocent people, and so that sends a message around the world that this kind of behaviour is acceptable, and that this kind of behaviour can be replicated by the allies of the West, of which Saudi Arabia is unfortunately one of the key ones in the Middle East.
Putting it all together, we invited the public to consider if these attacks breed love or hatred for the US and her allies?
No, I don't think it would breed love towards the U.S.
More hatred because it's the people all the way in the Middle East that are doing this stuff, so.
Well, initially it will certainly bring hatred.
Violence incites violence. And that's my answer. Violence incites violence.
Probably more hatred than love.
I'm guessing more likely hatred. Yeah, I'm thinking hatred.
Well, hatred. Absolutely.
Will these attacks provoke warmth or rage towards America and her allies? Let's give the last word to our experts.
Ultimately, hypocrisy breeds hatred, and the fact that the United States has a very clear policy of double standards within the region when criticising other Arab governments for use of force and violence, and when it commits violence itself is actually very dismissive of the fact, it creates a level of hypocrisy and a precedent which makes many in the Middle East and the Arab world actually gain this form of contempt towards the United States. Not necessarily because it has invaded a Muslim country and an Arab country time and time again, but it's the standards which the United States sets when it criticises governments in the region, when it itself adheres to a very brutal policy in its military interventions within the region. Ultimately, there is no consistency in US foreign policy, and this in tandem has led to a very harsh criticism of Washington in many sectors and areas within the Arab world and the Muslim world. Now, if the United States was to portray a more consistent policy where it actually owned up to its own problems and crimes within the region, then it would be on a level moral basis to actually criticise some of the Arab governments, such as in Syria and Iraq, which it has been criticising. But its own human rights record is as atrocious as many of the states which it itself has been criticising in the region.
Well, I mean, I think in a certain sense that is a question that answers itself. Any organisation or any military that attacks a hospital and kills loads of patients and staff is bound to be massively resented, is bound to cause a huge amount of bitterness amongst the population. And this is one of the most disastrous things about the war on terror. It claims to be a war aiming to reduce kind of terrorist attacks and jihadi activity around the world. But actually, if you look at the record of the war on terror since 2001, there's been a massive increase of jihadism in a whole arc across the globe, from Central Asia right through the Middle East into whole parts of Africa. And that's unfortunately not particularly surprising given the level of suffering, the level of destruction that has been caused by the war. So I'm afraid to say I can only imagine that these kind of incidents, and there have been quite a few of them, will do nothing other than to increase the level of anger and the level of hatred that people in Afghanistan and other countries feel against the Western powers.
Throughout modern history, hospitals have been iconic as sanctuaries for human life, even in war situations. Yet, in an act that showed no respect for the sanctity of human life, the US chose to deliberately strike a blow against a place of healing, and one run by a humanitarian charity. In doing so, America didn't just kill 30 people, it also left itself morally compromised, as others quickly followed this terrible precedent in Yemen with equally deadly results.